While only with Kant and German idealism, the excess to be thought is absolutely immanent, the very core of subjectivity itself, which is why, as you probably know, with German idealism, the metaphor for the very core of subjectivity is no longer light, the light of reason, but night, what Hegel called the night of the world. So when in the pre-Kantian universe a hero goes mad, it means he is deprived of his humanity. That is to say, animal passions or divine madness took over. While with Kant, madness signals the unconstrained explosion of the very core of a human being. And this dimension, I think, is missing also in Levinas. In a properly dialectical paradox, what is missing in Levinas, with all his celebration of otherness, is not some underlying sameness of all humans, but the radical inhuman dimension, the otherness to humanity itself, the otherness of a human, of being reduced to inhumanity, the otherness exemplified among others by the terrifying figure of musulman, the living dead in the concentration camps. I should only refer here to the wonderful book by Agamben, his What Remains of Auschwitz, where he writes in a wonderful way about the paradoxical ethical status of Muslims, musulman, in the concentration camps. Which is why, although Levinas is often perceived as the thinker who endeavored to articulate the experience of Shoah, usually called Holocaust, one thing is self-evident apropos his questioning of one's own right to be, apropos his emphasis on my unconditional asymmetrical responsibility. This is not how a survivor of the Shoah, how one effectively experiencing the ethical abyss of Shoah thinks and writes. This is how, I claim, those who feel guilty for observing the catastrophe from a minimal safe distance think. Is the paradox of the musulman in the concentration camp not that this figure is simultaneously a zero level, total reduction to life, a zero level of life, and a name for the pure excess as such, excess deprived of its normal base. This is why the figure of the musulman signals the limitation of Levinas. When describing it, Primo Levi repeatedly uses the predicate faceless. And this term should be given, I think here, its entire Levinasian weight. When confronted with a musulman, one precisely cannot discern in his face the trace of the abyss of the other, addressing us with the infinite call of our responsibility. What one gets is a kind of blind wall, a lack of depth. Maybe musulman is thus the zero-level neighbor, the neighbor with whom no emphatic face-to-face relationship is possible. For this same reason, Levinas is also unable to take the properly Christian path of ethical paradoxes, of the so-called teleological suspension of the ethical, outlined by Kierkegaard. In the chapter of his Either Or, in the volume 1, called The Ancient Tragical Motive as Reflected in the Modern, Kierkegaard deployed his fantasy of what a modern Antigone would have been. The conflict, he claims, is now entirely internalized. There is no longer a need for Creon. While Antigone admires and loves her father Oedipus, the public hero and savior of Thebes, she knows the truth about him, murderer of the father, incestuous marriage, and so on. Her deadlock is that she is prevented from sharing this accursed knowledge, like Abraham, who also could not communicate to others the divine injunction to sacrifice his son. She cannot complain, she cannot share her pain and sorrow with others. In contrast to Sophocles' Antigone, who acts, buries her brother, and thus actively assumes her fate, Kierkegaard's Antigone is unable to act, condemned forever to impassive suffering. This unbearable burden of her secret, of her destructive agalma, finally drives her to death, in which only she can find peace, otherwise provided by symbolizing, sharing with others one's pain and sorrow. And Kierkegaard's point is that this situation is no longer properly tragic, in a similar way that Abraham, also for Kierkegaard, is not a tragic figure. Now I'm tempted to go here a step further. Insofar as Kierkegaard's Antigone is a paradigmatically modern figure, should one not go on with this mental experiment and imagine a postmodern Antigone, with, of course, I cannot escape my nature, a Stalinist twist. In contrast to the modern one, modern Antigone, the postmodern one should find herself in a position in which, to quote Kierkegaard himself, the ethical dimension, the ethical itself would be the temptation. One version would undoubtedly be for Antigone to publicly renounce, denounce and accuse her father, or in a different version, her brother Polynices, accuse him of his terrible sins out of her unconditional love for him. The Kierkegaardian catch is that such a public act would render Antigone even more isolated, absolutely alone. No one, with the exception of Oedipus himself, if he were still to be alive, would understand that her act of betrayal is the supreme act of love. Antigone would thus be entirely deprived of her sublime, of this shining, fascinating, sublime beauty. So again, what I'm trying to imagine, you got it, is the Stalinist trial against Oedipus and Antigone playing the role, of the Stalinist wife of the accused, had to accuse your own relatives of being traitors and so on and so on. And do not misunderstand me here. My point is not to play games through horrors and so on and so on. I think that if we are to go to the end in what the ethical experience of what 20th century means within the horizon of our ethical experience, we should go through this zero level, where it experiences the gap between the absolute dimension, Kierkegaard called this theological, and ethical at its purest, where we experience how, as Kierkegaard put it, ethical itself is a temptation to be resisted. Now let me conclude just with two final points. The first one, I think, is that the radical conclusion to be drawn from all this is that, precisely apropos of Antigone, is that one should renounce the very striving for one's own spiritual salvation. Here I agree with Levinas, who himself quotes a very nice passage from Léon Brunswick, the old French philosopher of the early 20th century, who claims that, quote from Brunswick, "The preoccupation with our salvation is a remnant of self-love, a trace of natural egocentrism from which we must be torn by the religious life." But I claim that we have to make here a step further. I claim that what we find at the end of this road is atheism, not the ridiculously pathetic spectacle of heroic defiance of God, but the insight into the irrelevance of the divine. I would like to finish with a quote from Brecht's Geschichte, Stories of Herr Keuner, this Kafkaesque figure in Brecht, where one concerns precisely the question of atheism. Here is Brecht's short 5 lines passage. Someone asked Herr Keuner, Mr. Keuner, if there is a God. Herr Keuner said, "I advise you to think about how your behavior would change with regard to the answer to this question. If it would not change, then we can drop the question. If it would change, then I can help you at least insofar as I can tell you. You already decided. You need a God." So the true atheism is, again, to make question itself meaningless. And I think Brecht is right here. Again, we are never in a position to directly choose between theism and atheism, since the choice as such is located within the field of belief. Atheism, in the sense of heroically deciding not to believe in God, is the miserable, pathetic stance of those who long for God but cannot find Him, or who rebel against God, and so on and so on. A true atheist does not choose atheism. For him, the question itself is irrelevant. And the last remark, with which I would like to return to my starting quote from Alain Badiou, about this pitiless, the need for us to become pitiless censor, that is to say how we should reject this injunction in joy. I claim that we live in a very paradoxical time today, where one of the characteristics of our times is that, in contrast to previous times, where at least there appeared to be some kind of a tension between religious moral beliefs and your right to enjoy,